security guard shoved black woman out of boardroom didn't know. She was buying the whole floor. She had been standing in the hallway for less than 40 seconds when the hand landed on her shoulder. Not a tap, not a polite redirection. A grip, firm and dismissive, the kind that said, "You do not belong here." Without a single word needing to be spoken. The hand belonged to a man in a gray uniform with a silver badge pinned above his left breast pocket, and he steered her backward through the glass door, the same way you might move a piece of furniture out of the way, without looking at her face, without asking her name, without a moment's hesitation. "This floor is restricted to authorized personnel and registered guests," he said to the middle distance somewhere above her head. "You'll need to take the elevator back to the lobby." The woman he had just removed from the 43rd floor of the Carver Tower did not raise her voice. She did not plant her feet. She let him move her into the hallway, and she stood there for a moment with her leather portfolio pressed against her chest, and she looked at the closed glass door, and she breathed once, slowly, the way a person breathes when they have spent a lifetime learning how to absorb something without letting it show. Her name was Vivienne Mensa. She was 41 years old. She had flown in from London that morning, on a direct flight she owned a stake in, and she was scheduled to be sitting inside that boardroom in exactly 11 minutes to finalize the purchase of every rentable square foot on floors 40 through 45 of the building she had just been removed from. But the security guard did not know that, and neither did the man who had sent him. Nah, they really had no idea who they were dealing with. Let's get into it. Vivienne was born in Kumasi, Ghana, in the winter of 1982, the second child of a woman named Abena Osi, and a man who drove a truck between the city and the coast and came home, on weekends smelling of diesel and sea salt. The house they lived in had 2 rooms and a courtyard shared with 2 other families, and in the rainy season the courtyard flooded, and the children would stand on the low concrete wall and watch the water rise and fall like something breathing. Her mother was a seamstress. Not in the way that word sometimes gets used to suggest a small domestic hobby, but in the serious, commercial, load-bearing way. A woman who ran a business from a single sewing machine that sat on a table in the front room, who had 8 regular clients before Vivienne started school and 42 by the time Vivienne finished secondary. Abena could look at a woman's shoulders and know her measurements within a centimeter. She could reconstruct a garment from a photograph. She could do what most people in the trade could not, which was hold the whole picture in her head, the fabric, the drape, the body moving inside the cloth, and produce something that felt inevitable rather than constructed. Vivienne watched her do this for 18 years and absorbed something from it that she could not have named at the time, but that would later become the foundation of everything she built. Her mother did not just sew. Her mother solved problems. She looked at what was missing and figured out what shape it needed to take. The inheritance Vivienne carried from her father was different. It was not a methodology but an object. When he died of a heart attack on the road between Kumasi and Takoradi in 1999, the thing that came back with his belongings in a brown paper parcel was a small spiral notebook, water-warped at the edges, in which he had kept a running record of every delivery he had ever made. The date, the distance, the cargo, the fuel cost, and at the bottom of each entry, a single line noting whether the trip had been worth it. Not worth it financially, though the numbers were there. Worth it in some broader sense that he never defined but that Vivienne understood as soon as she read the first page. He had been keeping track of whether his life was moving in a direction he could be proud of. She carried that notebook in the inner pocket of her portfolio for the next 22 years. She came to London at 20 on a scholarship to study economics at University College London, and she arrived with 2 suitcases, a reference letter from her secondary school headmaster, and the kind of focus that people who have not had things handed to them tend to develop when opportunity finally presents itself. She was not the best student in her cohort academically, but she was the most attentive to the things that happened outside the classroom. The patterns in the way capital moved, the geography of which neighborhoods were being ignored, the specific texture of the gap between what a building was worth and what someone was willing to pay to develop it. She graduated in 2004 and took a junior position at a mid-sized property consultancy in East London. She was the only black woman in the office. She was paid less than the two men who started the same week she did, a fact she confirmed quietly and privately within her first month, by asking the right questions in the right tone over coffee. She filed the information away. She did not raise it. She had learned from her mother that you did not waste your energy on battles that drained you, when the real work was elsewhere. She spent 4 years at that consultancy learning every corner of the business, and then she left and started her own firm with a business partner named Clara Asante, whom she had met at UCL, and who had the kind of instinct for legal structures that Vivienne had for markets. They called the firm Abena Capital, named, without ceremony or explanation, for Vivienne's mother. They opened in a 2-room office above a dry cleaner in Hackney, with a coffee maker and a shared desk calendar, and a list of 15 properties in East London that Vivienne had identified as systematically undervalued. By 2015, Abena Capital had assets under management of over £400 million. By 2019, it was over £1 billion. They had expanded into commercial real estate in New York, Toronto, and Lagos. They had a staff of 63. They had been profiled in the Financial Times and in Forbes. Clara had been named to the board of the UK's National Infrastructure Commission, and Vivienne's photograph had appeared on the cover of a magazine that sat, at this very moment, in the waiting area on the lobby level of the Carver Tower in downtown Atlanta, where she had just been physically removed from a boardroom by a man whose name she did not yet know, but whose badge number she had already noted in the small notebook she kept in the outer pocket of her portfolio, the one beside her father's notebook, which she never went anywhere without. The Carver Tower was the kind of building that announced itself before you arrived. 48 stories of blue glass and steel on the edge of Midtown Atlanta, with a lobby that had been designed to communicate power through the specific vocabulary of polished stone and high ceilings, and a reception desk, positioned like an altar at the center of everything. It had been built in 2017 by a development group called Meridian Consolidated, and it had been, for most of its existence, a moderately successful commercial property, good but not exceptional, the kind of address that attracted solid mid-tier tenants rather than the marquee names a building of its scale was designed for. The problem was floors 40 through 45. 6 floors of premium office space with floor-to-ceiling windows and the kind of southeastern exposure that made the Atlanta skyline look like something staged for a film. They had been sitting largely vacant for 19 months. The anchor tenant who had committed to floors 42 and 43 had pulled out of the deal when their parent company restructured. The remaining spaces had attracted interest but no commitments. It was starting to cost Meridian in ways that showed up in their quarterly reports. Abena Capital had been in discussions to acquire a long-term leasehold on all 6 floors for the better part of 4 months. The deal had been structured, reviewed by legal on both sides, and was now within a single closing meeting of being finalized. It was not a small transaction. Across a 15-year term with the options Vivienne had negotiated, the value of the agreement ran past $60 million. Vivienne had flown from London to Atlanta specifically for this meeting. She had arrived at the Carver Tower at 9:47 in the morning, 12 minutes ahead of the 10 o'clock meeting time. She had been met in the lobby by a junior associate from the Meridian team named Tyler, who had walked her to the elevator and told her the meeting room was on 43, and then been called back to the front desk before the elevator arrived. And so Vivienne had gone up alone. The man at the front desk who had called Tyler back was named Craig Holloway. He was Meridian's head of building operations, a title that meant he managed the physical infrastructure of the tower, the security teams, the maintenance staff, the access systems. He was 53 years old and had been with Meridian for 11 years, and had developed, over that time, a set of assumptions about who belonged where in a building like this that were not written in any policy document, but that governed his decisions, with remarkable consistency. When he saw on the security camera feed that a black woman in a winter coat was stepping off the elevator alone onto the 43rd floor, a floor he had not received formal guest registration for, because Tyler had not completed the lobby check-in before being pulled away, he picked up his radio and asked the guard on 43 to redirect her. He did not check the meeting schedule. He did not call Tyler. He did not ask the woman her name. He looked at the image on the screen for approximately 4 seconds and made a decision. The guard who received the call was a man named Marcus Webb. He was 26 years old and had been on the job for 8 months and had been trained to defer to directives from building operations without question. He was not a cruel person. He was a person who did what he was told, which is a different thing but can produce the same outcomes. He found Vivienne in the corridor outside the main boardroom, reading the framed building directory on the wall, and he delivered the message he had been given. What he did not know, what Craig Holloway had not thought to find out, was that standing 30 feet away at the far end of the same corridor, partially visible through the glass partition wall of a smaller conference room, was a woman named Delia Park. Delia was a paralegal at the law firm of Hutchins and Vance, which was the legal counsel for Meridian, consolidated on the Abena Capital transaction. She had arrived early to prepare the closing documents. She had also, because she was 31 years old and had grown up in an era where the documentation of certain moments had become a form of witness, taken out her phone when she saw a uniformed guard put his hand on the shoulder of the woman she had just spent 4 months processing paperwork for, and pressed record. She did not announce that she was recording. She held the phone at desk level and kept it steady, and did not look away. Vivienne took the elevator back to the lobby. She did not go to the street. She went to the lobby seating area, where she sat down on a low white chair near the window, set her portfolio on her knee, and opened it to the section marked with a blue tab. She found the direct number for Robert Hutchins, senior partner at Hutchins and Vance, and she called it. "Robert," she said when he answered, "I'm in your client's lobby. I've just been removed from the 43rd floor by a security guard who, I believe, was acting on instruction from someone on your client's operations team. I'd like you to call whoever is running point on the Meridian side and let them know I'm here, and I'd like someone to come to the lobby and escort me to the closing meeting, which I believe we agreed starts in about 6 minutes." There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough to be meaningful. "Vivienne," Robert said carefully, "are you serious?" "I flew 11 hours to be here, Robert," she said. "Yes, I'm serious." There was a brief conversation she was not privy to on the other end of the line. Then Robert said he would call her back in 2 minutes. And he did, and he told her that Elliot Marsh, the CEO of Meridian Consolidated, was personally coming down to the lobby to bring her up. Vivienne said that was fine. She closed her portfolio. She looked at the magazine on the table beside her and registered, without particular feeling, that the cover story was about the 50 most influential women in global real estate. She was on the cover. She had not put it there. She had not known it would be there, but it was there. She picked up her father's notebook from her inner pocket and held it in both hands for a moment, and then she put it back and she stood up when the elevator doors opened. "Yo, you could not write this if you tried. Hold on. Let's see what happened next." Elliot Marsh was 58 years old and had the specific bearing of a man who had spent 3 decades being the most important person in most rooms he entered. He was tall, silver-haired, expensively suited, and wore the expression of someone who had been told something on the elevator ride down that had rearranged his morning considerably. He crossed the lobby toward Vivienne, with his hand already extended, and his voice already carrying the particular frequency of a man performing an apology without fully committing to one. "Miss Mensa," he said, "I want to personally apologize for the confusion this morning. There was a miscommunication with our operations team regarding your check-in, and I want to assure you that it in no way reflects our Elliot," Vivienne said, and something in the way she said his name, not unkindly, but with a precision that made clear she was not interested in the version of this he had prepared on the elevator, stopped him mid-sentence. "Let's go upstairs. We have a meeting to finish." He nodded. He pressed the elevator button himself. He stood slightly to the side as the doors opened, in the way that people stand when they are recalibrating their understanding of a situation. On the 43rd floor, the boardroom had filled in the 20 minutes since Vivienne had last been near it. Around the long table sat 6 members of the Meridian legal and executive team, 3 representatives from Hutchins and Vance, including Robert Hutchins himself, and Clara Asante, who had flown in from New York, and who looked up when Vivienne entered and offered a small, composed nod that communicated several things at once, without saying any of them. Craig Holloway was also in the room. He had been called to the meeting by Elliot Marsh, though he had not been told exactly why. and he was sitting at the far end of the table, with the expression of a man who has begun to understand that he is not there in a good capacity. Marcus Webb was not there. He had returned to his post on the floor and had no idea what was about to unfold, which was perhaps the most merciful arrangement for him. Robert Hutchins opened the meeting. He went through the formalities, the parties, the document set, the structure of the transaction. He spoke for about 4 minutes in the careful, measured tone of a man who is trying to keep the atmosphere in a room from reaching a particular temperature. Then Elliot Marsh spoke. He thanked everyone for their time, and expressed Meridian's enthusiasm for the partnership, and said that he hoped what had occurred earlier in the morning, he did not specify what, would not cast a shadow over what was, he believed, a significant and mutually beneficial agreement. Clara Asante looked at Vivian across the table. Vivian looked at Elliot Marsh. "Before we sign," Vivian said, in the same calm and unhurried voice she used for most things, "I'd like to understand what instructions were given to your operations team this morning and by whom." The temperature in the room did change then, not dramatically. More the way a room changes when someone opens a window, and the air becomes suddenly, precisely different. Elliot looked at Craig. Craig looked at the table. "It was a miscommunication," Craig said. "The check-in hadn't been completed when Ms. Osi-Mensah came up, so I asked Marcus to remove me from the floor," Vivian said. "To redirect you," Craig said. "To ask you to check in properly in the lobby." "He put his hand on my shoulder and walked me out of the corridor," Vivian said. "I'd like to know whether that was consistent with the instructions you gave him, or whether that was his own initiative." The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. The kind that exists in the space between what someone wants to say and what they understand they cannot say. Robert Hutchins placed both hands flat on the table. He looked at Craig Holloway with an expression that was not warm. "Craig," Elliot Marsh said, in a voice that had lost the warmth it had come in with, "did you review the meeting register before calling Marcus?" Craig said nothing for a moment. Then he said no. He had seen on the camera that there was a woman on the floor without a completed check-in, and he had acted on standard protocol. "Is there a standard protocol," Vivian said, "or is there a judgment that you made about what that woman was likely to be doing on that floor?" She did not say it with heat. She said it the way her mother used to say things when she was showing a client a seam that had been done wrong. Matter of fact, without drama, in a tone that made the truth harder to argue with than if it had been delivered at volume. "Man, you hear the way she handled that? Not one raised voice. Not one moment of losing herself. Let's keep going because this is where everything opens up." It was Delia Park who changed the temperature of the room a second time. She had come up from the smaller conference room when the meeting began, and she was sitting at the side table against the wall, with a stack of closing folders in front of her. She was not a principal in the meeting. She was there to distribute documents when asked. But she had been in the building that morning, and she had seen what she had seen, and she had recorded it, and she had sent the file to Robert Hutchins from the elevator on her way up. Robert Hutchins, who had watched it twice before the meeting started, cleared his throat. "I think," he said carefully, "that we have something that may be relevant to this conversation." He looked at Delia. Delia opened her laptop. She turned it to face the center of the table and pressed play. The footage was 37 seconds long. It was shot from a low angle through a glass partition, slightly soft in focus but entirely clear in its content. It showed Marcus Webb approaching Vivian in the corridor. It showed his hand on her shoulder. It showed him steering her toward the elevator while speaking to her. It showed Vivian's back, straight, her portfolio held against her chest, her pace unhurried even as she was being moved. It showed all of this without ambiguity. When it finished, no one in the room spoke for several seconds. Elliot Marsh was looking at Craig Holloway with an expression that had passed through embarrassment and arrived somewhere harder. Craig Holloway was looking at the screen as though he was considering whether there was an alternative version of what he had just watched. There was not. "Elliot," Robert Hutchins said, in the steady tone of a man who has handled difficult rooms for 30 years, "I think we need to address what's on that recording before we proceed with execution of any documents." Elliot nodded slowly. He said yes. He said he agreed entirely. He turned to Vivian. What he said next took longer than it should have, and was structured more around protecting. Meridian's position, then genuinely acknowledging what had occurred, and Vivienne sat through all of it with the same composure she had maintained for the entire morning. When he finished, she waited a beat, the way her mother used to wait before responding to something that needed to be received, properly before it could be answered. "I appreciate that," she said. "I want to be clear about what happened. I was removed from this floor without being asked my name, without being given an opportunity to explain who I was or why I was here, and on the basis of a decision that took less than 5 seconds, and that I think we all understand was not based on an incomplete check-in form. I've been in this industry for 19 years. I've closed transactions on 4 continents. This morning was not the first time something like this has happened to me, and I doubt it will be the last. But it happened here, in your building, on a morning when I was here to sign a $60 million agreement. And I think the question of what Meridian does with that fact is one you need to answer for yourselves, not for me." She paused. "Now, shall we finalize the documents?" The room was very quiet. Then Clara Asante, for the first time all morning, spoke. "Robert," she said, "I believe we also discussed a modification to the indemnity clause on page 47. Let's start there." And just like that, the work continued. They executed the documents at 11:22 in the morning. The signing took 14 minutes. Vivienne signed her name on 12 separate pages in the same unhurried, deliberate hand she used for everything. When it was done, Robert Hutchins gathered the folders and his team began to organize themselves, and Elliot Marsh stood and extended his hand across the table. Vivienne shook it. "For what it's worth," Elliot said quietly. "For her ears and not the room's. What happened this morning was wrong, and I take responsibility for the environment that allowed it." Vivienne looked at him steadily. "Then change the environment," she said. It was not a suggestion. It was not a challenge. It was simply what she said. She picked up her portfolio. She exchanged a look with Clara that contained a full conversation in about a quarter of a second. She thanked Robert Hutchins by name and by specific reference to the quality of the legal preparation, which had been genuinely meticulous. And then she walked out of the boardroom, past the corridor where she had been stopped that morning, and pressed the button for the elevator. The lobby magazine was still on the table when she came back down. She looked at it for a moment. Then she left it there. It was not hers. It was just a fact about her. Like a lot of other facts. She had been building something for 19 years, and the building was what mattered, not the pictures people took of it. What happened to Craig Holloway in the weeks that followed was documented publicly enough to be a matter of record. Meridian Consolidated opened an internal review within 48 hours of the closing meeting, initiated, according to a statement from Elliot Marsh, by the evidence captured in Delia Park's recording, and by the findings of that review, which identified a pattern of access decisions in Holloway's operational logs that were inconsistent with stated protocol when examined across 18 months of data. He was placed on administrative leave within 5 days and separated from the company 3 weeks later. Meridian's board issued a public statement acknowledging that the incident reflected a systemic failure of oversight rather than an isolated event. They engaged an independent consultancy to audit their building operations protocols. Marcus Webb was not terminated. He was a 26-year-old man who had done what he was told. He was retrained, reassigned to a different floor, and later, in a detail that did not appear in the press coverage, but that Vivienne learned from a source inside the building, enrolled in an unconscious bias certification program that Meridian added to all security staff onboarding as a direct result of the incident. 3 months after the closing, Abina Capital began the build-out of floors 40 through 45. The flagship space on 43 was designed as a collaborative workspace anchored by a central atrium with a large piece of commissioned artwork. On the east wall, a textile installation, woven in kente patterns designed by a Ghanaian artist Vivienne had known since secondary school and had been trying to find the right wall for years. The piece was made in sections, like her mother's garments, and assembled on-site over 4 days. The placard beside it read in small plain text, "For Abina." 6 months after execution, Abina Capital announced a scholarship program in partnership with 2 historically black universities in the southeastern United States, funded by a portion of the returns from the Carver Tower lease. The scholarship was for students in real estate development, urban planning, and commercial finance. It covered full tuition and provided a mentorship placement within Abina Capital's operations for the duration of study. In the first year, 11 students were enrolled. By the second year, the program had a waiting list. Vivian was asked in an interview what she wanted the scholarship to accomplish. She thought about it for a moment before she answered, which was how she approached most things. "I want students to understand," she said, "that the market is full of gaps that people with power have decided are not worth filling, and that the people who understand those gaps the best are almost never the ones who created them. That's where the work is. That's always been where the work is." She did not mention the morning in Atlanta in that interview. She rarely mentioned it. It had happened, and what had happened after it had happened, and she had a building full of offices to lease, and a team in 4 cities, and a waiting list of students, and a textile installation her mother had not lived to see, but that had been made for her anyway. She kept her father's notebook in her pocket. She kept his practice of noting, at the end of each entry, whether it had been worth it. Every entry for the past 3 years had the same answer, and that's the story of Vivienne Osimensa and the 43rd floor of the Carver Tower. Now, this story is fictional, but everything it reaches for is real. The assumptions that get made in lobbies and corridors and elevators every single day, the composure it takes to absorb them without losing yourself, the kind of work that gets done quietly, over years, that the world only notices when someone has a camera. Here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever been in a room where someone underestimated you, or watched it happen to someone else, and had to decide whether to say something or let it go? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. If this story hit different, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We've got more stories where this one came from.